Good evening. It's a pleasure to present my paper entitled Arriving and Already Being There, Phenomenology of the Gaze, Borders, and Alterity in Contemporary Societies. In this work, I reflect on the relationship between migration, alterity, language, and visuality, seeking to understand how the gaze participates in the symbolic construction of the other in contemporary societies. I begin with a simple observation. We live in a time marked by intense human, technological, cultural, and symbolic mobility. Never before have so many people, images, stories, and pieces of information crossed borders so quickly. However, despite this growing mobility, we also see the strengthening of identity discourses, mechanisms of exclusion, and new forms of producing difference. In this context, the figure of the migrants becomes one of the most significant images of contemporary life, bringing together questions of belonging, recognition, borders, and alterity. The central argument of this paper is that borders do not begin with geography before they exist as territorial lines. Borders are created through culture, discourse, and perception. In other words, the separation between us and them, between the familiar and the unfamiliar, is produced through language, social discourses, and ways of seeing the world. Alterity comes less from physical distance than from the symbolic systems that shape our experience of looking. To develop this reflection, I use a hermeneutic and phenomenological approach, drawing on actors such as Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, Paul Ricoeur, Benveniste, Crémas, Emmanuel Levinas, Hans John, Marc Auger, and Jacques Rancière. My aim is not simple to analyze migration as a political or legal phenomenon, but to understand it as an existential, narrative, perceptual, and ethical experience. One of the main ideas of the paper is that a migrant is not only someone who crosses a physical border. Very often, what defines a person as a migrant is the way he or she is seen, named, and interpreted by others. The other does not exist only because there is an objective difference. The other is also produced through cultural process of meaning making. Language plays an important role here, as Benveniste and Greimas suggest. Identities are built through difference. The we exists because there is a they. Belonging is often defined through the symbolic production of what is considered outside. At the same time, phenomenology helps us to understand that the gaze is never neutral. Merleau-Ponty showed that seeing is not simply receiving image. Seeing is an embodied experience carried out by a body situated in history and culture. The gaze organizes proximity and distance, familiarity and strangeness. What we perceived as different depends not only on what we see, but also on how we have learned to see. Very often, what appears strange is something that our gaze has learned to recognize as strange. This question is especially relevant today in a world marked by an endless flow of image and by the growing influence of technology. Digital platforms, media systems, and algorithms do not simply show us the world, they organize ways of seeing. They create forms of recognition, invisibility, and exclusion. Contemporary ways of looking actively participate in the symbolic construction of alterity, defining who is visible, who is recognized, and who remains outside. Another important concept in the paper is the idea of dwelling or belonging. Inspired by Heidegger, I argue that arriving does not necessarily mean belonging. Many people physically arrived in a place without being fully accepted as a part of it. Migrants often find themselves in a condition between presence and exclusion. They have arrived, but they are still seen as coming from outside. Belonging depends not only on geography, but also on symbolic recognition. This reflection leads to a broader question. Perhaps the migrant is not only a political or territorial category. Perhaps the migrant reveals something deeper about human condition itself. All of us experience movements, changings, losses, transformations, and continuous process of rebuilding our identities. We live through memories, transitions, and temporary forms of belonging. In this sense, the migrant can be understood as a symbol of the contemporary condition. The ethical dimension of this discussion is strongly influenced by Emmanuel Levinas. For Levinas, the face of the other calls us before any category or definition. Before being a statistic, an administrative category, or a media image, the other appears as a unique presence that demands recognition and responsibility. Yet, contemporary societies often transform migrants into abstractions, reducing this ethical encounter. For this reason, the paper also reflects on hospitality. In a world characterized by increasing mobility, systems of classification, and even ever more complex symbolic borders, it becomes necessary to rethink how we welcome and recognize others. The issue is not only migration policy, it is also about questioning the ways we learn to see and interpret those who arrived. I would like to conclude by returning to the main idea of the paper. Contemporary society requires an ethical and aesthetic rethinking of the gaze. We need to learn again how to see behind automatic categories that organize difference. We need to move behind systems of classification that reduce the other to a treat, a statistic, or an outsider. To dwell poetically in the world may mean precisely this, welcoming what arrives before immediately turning it to a category. Perhaps in the end, we are all migrants within our own existence. Thank you very much for your attention.